Thank you for staying with us on Citizen Weekend. We now get into that conversation with Jason Stearns on the crisis in the Congo. But first, let's get better acquainted with him. And I did mention earlier that he's an associate professor, international relations. But other than that, that is actually a situation, recapping the situation in the Congo. But before then, let's get a sense of who Jason is. He is a political scientist, and he did his MA, PhD at Yale University. He has published 2 books on the situation in the Congo, and he was coordinator of a UN team that, sort of evaluated the security situation in the DRC. Let's now take a look at what the situation in the Congo has been. And the UN has reported 3,000 deaths and about 2,800 injuries, not to mention those who have been displaced. And also, I just wanted to highlight some of the resolutions that were passed today. Let's take a look at those. All right, there we go. The numbers I was talking about earlier. The death toll, 3,000, injured 2,880. And in terms of the resolutions that were passed, the chiefs of defense forces of the SADC and EAC were given 5 days to meet and pass and give various plans as regards the security situation in the eastern DRC. But some of the resolutions that were passed, as were highlighted in that report by Seth Olale, include an unconditional ceasefire, defense chiefs, as I mentioned, to develop securitization plan for Goma, opening of main supply routes, immediate reopening of the Goma airport, consolidation of the Nairobi and Rwanda peace processes, resumption of direct negotiations, including with M23, disengagement of Rwanda forces in the DRC, and plan for neutralization of FDLR. Listening to those resolutions, Jason, are you encouraged?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's good that this is back in the headlines again. I think it will be difficult for the M23 to launch a new offensive, given all of the attention on it now. At the same time, most of this is already included in previous statements. Then there's a process, there's both an African Union process as well as an East African Community process underway, the Nairobi and Luanda processes, as they're called, and they already include most of this language. And so it's unclear what new developments this will bring forward. Some of it's quite vague, and they kick it off. They say that there'll be technical committees that will now be meeting to put some flesh on the bones of this. And I think what many Congolese were hoping, certainly the Congolese government was hoping for, was for these heads of state to call for a withdrawal of the M23 troops from Goma, this city of 1.5 million people that has now been occupied by the M23. They did not do that, and they didn't even actually call for the withdrawal of Rwandan troops from the eastern Congo. So I think the Congolese government in particular is not going to be totally happy with this declaration.
All right. So just looking at some of these resolutions, for example, direct negotiations, including with M23. This is a group that Tshisekedi has described as a terrorist group. Do you view this as a change of, what do you make of this particular resolution?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we'll have to see. It certainly seems like the text is saying there should now be a negotiation. It says direct negotiations with the M23. The Congolese government has agreed to negotiate with the M23 within the Nairobi process, so to sit around a table with the M23 as well as other armed groups. It's not unclear whether this now means that the Congolese government's committing to only talk directly to the M23 without other armed groups present. And so, we have to see. I asked the same question to a presidential advisor this evening. He didn't give me a straight answer. So I think that it's in coming days we'll know much more about that. But if that indeed is what they're saying, then that's a concession the Congolese government has made.
And it'll be interesting to see whether they remain designated a terrorist organization or whether they'll be redesignated a political organization, because they're under the Congo River Alliance. And then there was the statements around respecting the territorial integrity of the DRC, and there was talk of disengagement of Rwandan forces. Just the other day, we had President Kagame tell CNN he didn't know whether there were Rwandan troops on ground in the DRC. Is this...
That's correct.
Is this effectively an admission that they are?
Well, I think, Kagame has said many things, and it's not always entirely clear whether they've admitted or not. They've both rejected categorically as well as been extremely ambiguous, as you just mentioned. So it's unclear. I think what is clear to all the diplomats involved is that they are, in fact, present. Most people estimate between 4,000 and 7,000 Rwandan troops. There have been 6 independent United Nations reports showing this and proving this. And so he may reject that, but I think most people know it. It still was noticeable to me, at least in that communique, that they did not call Rwanda out particularly to withdraw its troops. They said it's within this process, the FDLR have to be neutralized, and then Rwanda should reconsider its defensive arrangements. Or something along those lines. And so I think that it was noticeable that it was I think, fairly favorable statement to the Rwandan government.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of FDLR, Rwanda has said that is essentially what has driven its spat with the DRC. It's defending its borders. These are the remnants of, the genocidal elements. Do you think that this reflects a give and take where both parties walk away with something? Rwanda disengages from DRC, meanwhile FDLR is quote unquote neutralized, and what would that look like?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, this has always been, this M23 rebellion is the 5th time Rwanda has backed an armed group in the Eastern Congo since 1996. And every single time, almost, when peace talks come up, this is the deal. The Congolese government has to do something about the FDLR, and the Rwandans will withdraw their troops. It's almost boilerplate at this point. It was already on the table in the Luanda process when Kagame and Tshisekedi were supposed to see each other in Angola last December. So this is nothing new, but we'll see whether they actually go through with this now. The Rwandans certainly like to emphasize this threat of the FDLR, but it is certainly not as much a threat as it used to be when the conflict started 28 years ago. And so this is, I think, as you pointed out, a way for diplomats to say, okay, we'll give a little bit to you, and then the Congolese will also get something.
Mm-hmm. And what do you make of this? The chief defense forces of the EAC SADC states have been given 5 days to meet and plan, develop a you get securitization plan. That's the word for Goma. But we already have SADC forces on ground, Burundian forces on ground. We have the defense forces, DRC defense forces. What does this translate to? Because we had EAC, they were there for a year. Yeah. They left. So what does this particular line mean to you?
Well, it's very vague. What is a securitization? I think many people in Goma would like to know what a securitization plan would look like. But I do think it's interesting now that you have, as you pointed out, the EAC, which was involved, had a mission in the DRC, and it was asked to leave again. And then SADC deployed a mission in the DRC and is now fighting on the ground in the DRC still. This is a way, I think, for the EAC and SADC to patch things up as institutions. And so we're now creating a new process whereby both of these institutions will be involved now in the DRC formally together. And I think that is something new, because you had the Nairobi process with the EAC, and then you had the Luanda process with the African Union. But this is something new, and it will put now chiefs of defense from both of those regional organizations together in the peace process, which is new.
So we've had a UN presence in the DRC since 1999. President Felix Tshisekedi had called for them to leave because he asked after 25 years, 26 years, the situation is more or less still restive. What did you make of the extension of their stay to December this year?
Well, I mean, I myself served in the UN peacekeeping mission many, many years ago. As you said, it's been there since 1999. It's been there for a very long time. And so what the UN mission there is today is not what it used to be. I think any UN peacekeeping mission is most useful when it's deployed within the context of a political process that it's involved in. And so at the height of the Great Congo Wars, the UN was brought in to facilitate a peace process, to bring the country together. And it was extremely important. I'm talking about the 1999 to 2006 process. The UN was an official part of that process. It was a guarantor of that process. And it helped usher in a new constitution, the Third Republic that the Congo is in now, which has democratic elections, democratic institutions, a new integrated national army. And the United Nations was critical in that entire process because it had that role. But ever since 2006, since those first democratic elections, the UN has been really politically sidelined, and it's been confined to what it does least best, which is the military, protecting civilians in imminent threat. That is very difficult for any peacekeeping mission to do, and the UN has not excelled at it. And so I think that many Congolese are now frustrated with this mission that has a budget of $1 billion a year, that they most often see people driving around in air-conditioned cars, not doing very much and collecting high salaries. And yet you have violence proliferating and the UN seems powerless to do it and to do anything about it. And so I think the UN mission is actually no longer fulfilling an important function, but that's not really its fault. That's because it's been politically marginalized. There is no peace process. There's no, or at least there is no functioning peace process at the moment. And even the Rwandan and Nairobi processes that we're talking about with the M23, the UN is not involved in those actually. And so you have this massive UN peacekeeping mission, and yet they're on the sidelines of all of the important processes.
And, this is a conflict that has persisted for 30 years. Just what is it about the eastern the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo?
Well, I mean, let's take this current M23 rebellion. It started in November of 2021. What was the origins of it? Now, as we've just discussed, the Rwandans have said that the origins of the rebellion are discrimination against Congolese Tutsi and the FDLR, this Rwandan rebel group that is threatening to Rwanda. But if you look at the origins of the M23 this time around, because this is the second M23 rebellion, what you'll find is that its origins are in a geopolitical battle for influence in the eastern Congo. Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi all have troops deployed in the eastern Congo. They all want their pound of flesh, so to say. They all have political security and economic interests in the eastern DRC. And so when Uganda moved its troops in November of 2021, Rwanda saw that as a threat, and they reacted by creating and backing a rebel group, the M23. To the south of them, Burundi has also deployed troops. And so this is really a geopolitical battle between these four countries. I think that's what's at the heart of it. And that's what's been at the heart of Congolese conflict since 1996. It's the inability of the Congolese government to control its own territory. It's weak. And neighboring countries take advantage of that. They take advantage of that militarily. Economically, last year, Rwanda exported $1.1 billion of minerals, much of that from the eastern DRC. And unfortunately, the Congolese population is left to suffer. We have 7 million people displaced in the eastern DRC, 3 million of whom because of the M23 conflict. And so, what is this about? I think this is really about power and control of this area.
And when you read about it, you hear of over 100 rebel groups. How do you engage all these rebel groups? Do you just deal with the bigger players and the smaller players will sort of, just die out? How do you manage that dynamic?
Well, I think you need to the M23, you need to do what you just said. You need to prioritize some groups. You're absolutely right. The M23 is certainly not the only threat in the eastern DRC. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is a crisis of governance. After all, the M23 is an armed group with roughly maybe 7,000 or 8,000 Rwandans and an equal number of M23 troops, but it's really the Rwandans doing most of the fighting. So even if there were 15,000, the Congolese government is 130,000 troops and has $1 billion defense budget. So why is it that the Congolese army hasn't been able to deal with the M23 or even these other groups, some of which are much, much smaller than the M23? And so this is really a crisis of governance and of state fragility and weakness. But that's a long-term problem. That cannot be solved in a few months. In order to be able to tackle these root causes, what you need to be able to do is you need to bring an end to this M23 conflict that's sucking all of the oxygen out of the room at the moment. And so I think the first step to that would be to bring pressure. It's actually quite an easy conflict to solve because Rwanda has such influence over the M23. It's really just the Rwandans that are fighting, and the international community has such influence over Rwanda. And so what is different this time around, actually, than the previous time, for example, in 2012, when the M23 first emerged, is that the international community that supplies $1 billion a year in aid to Rwanda has not actually sanctioned Rwanda, has not put pressure on Rwanda, and has let Rwanda, to a certain extent, get away with this. And so I think what you need to do in the short term is bring an end to the M23 crisis. It's actually not that difficult. That will open up space then to start a real process, a real political peace process that could grapple with some of the underlying problems, the communal reconciliation, land reform, governance, army reform, all these things. But that's impossible to do if you're in a situation of violent escalation. And so that's, I think, how I see the process working with all of those other 100 armed groups. There's a demobilization process that's supposed to start with these armed groups, but it's impossible to start demobilizing troops when we're in a process of mobilization and conflict.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the international community, because you mentioned donors, President William Ruto, chair of the EAC, East African Community, today made this statement, and I'll read it out to you. And he says, it is clear that the conflict in the DRC is complex, delicate, and protracted, and involves multiple actors pursuing different interests. The issues at stake span a wide historical, economic, and political spectrum, run back in time for many decades, and spill across national and regional borders. There is also and this is the part that I'd like you to pay attention to, clandestine international dimension at work, whose persistent, cynical, and destructive effects must neither be underestimated or ignored any longer. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That part there has been making the rounds now on social media, and I think many people are scratching their heads trying to figure out what exactly President Ruto meant about that. He could mean, I think, there's a common perception that the conflict is persisting because people are benefiting, multinational corporations are benefiting from the minerals in the eastern DRC. I think the truth of the matter is that many people are benefiting from this. As I said before, the Ugandan government, the Burundian government, and the Rwandan government's largest exports in all three of those countries are minerals from the eastern Congo. Where do those minerals go? They go mostly to Dubai because it's mostly gold, and almost all of that gold goes to the United Arab Emirates in Dubai. And so is it a case where there are shadowy multinational corporations benefiting from this? There are some corporations that are benefiting from this, but broadly speaking, I think it's mostly actually smaller actors that are benefiting from this. The large mining there are no large mining companies in the Eastern Congo because it's too violent for them to deploy there. It's too corrupt. The state is too weak. The infrastructure is not existent. And so what you have is pick and shovel miners funneling these minerals into these international supply chains. Eventually they end up in your smartphone. Eventually they end up in the jewelry that you wear. That is true. And there's definitely a weakness in monitoring those supply chains. But it was not clear to me either exactly who he was pointing the finger at there. He could be pointing the finger at the gold traders in Dubai. He could be pointing the finger at the United States. He could be pointing the finger at the Rwandan government itself. It's not entirely clear, but it's certainly a conception that many people have that there's shadowy networks out there benefiting from the conflict, and that's why it doesn't want to end.
And what do you make of Tshisekedi's choice to attend virtually as opposed to physically making his way to Dar es Salaam?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think a lot of people were disappointed in that. He sent his prime minister instead, and he attended virtually. And I think that's certainly, his right to do so. I think it was a shame. It showed, I think, that he himself was not entirely secure in his own position. There have been, just in recent days, a lot of rumors of political instability in Kinshasa. There's been reports of senior security officials being arrested or suspended or interrogated by the security services. There's a huge amount of disappointment in how his own army has performed on the battlefield. And so my guess is that's the reason that he didn't want to leave his own capital, Kinshasa, and travel to Dar es Salaam. But it did make him look weak, I think. And it deprived him of the ability to, a lot of these international meetings are heads of states. The real work happens in hotel rooms and in corridors and in informal sessions. He wasn't able to do that because he just attended via Zoom.
All right, thank you for speaking to us. Jason Stearns, political scientist. He was a coordinator, UN group of experts on the DRC 2008, author, Dancing in the Glory of Monster, The Collapse of the Congo and the Great War of Africa, published in 2010. Founder, Congo Research Group, New York University, that was founded in 2014. And author, most recently, published in 2022 by Princeton, publishes The War That Doesn't Say Its Name, The Unending Conflict in the Congo. So Jason, good luck in Addis Ababa. Thank you for speaking to us, and we plan on continuing to engage you on this subject. We take a break, but coming up,